The scene opens with an orchestral composition of natural sounds and whistles depicting an expansive landscape where a little girl sits in front of an artist, who constructs her portrait meticulously. The scene then cuts to a candlelit dinner table with Jean's mother, Anne, who raised her all on her own, seated at it. He is working for a generous Monsieur Dumusseau, who educated Jean, satisfying her desire for knowledge. They enjoy the pleasure of nice food with family and friends, and the intellectually charged conversation that always leaves Jean questioning and fueling her to learn. In the following scene, we catch sight of Monsieur Dumusseau teaching Jean. Being the father figure, he accompanies her throughout the day, determined to help her achieve high societal rank. However, Jean's life takes a different turn, as we witness Monsieur Dumusseau accompanying Jean to Sainte-Aure Monastery. This is an initiative to protect her from the life of fornication that normally working-class girls face. He bids her farewell, and now Jean is all alone before her fate. Years later, we find Jean by the river, enveloped in the consolation of books and culture. As has always been the case, she grows up to find the monastic life too oppressive. The forbidden books broaden her horizons, introducing her to eroticism. One day, a nun suddenly catches her reading, thus violating the sacred rules. Jean is finally expelled. Yet luck favors her when her mother, along with Mr. Dumusseau, receives her back warmly. Jean returns home and falls into a rhythm with Mr. Dumusseau, continuing their mutual learning. Mr. Dumusseau stands firm in the face of his wife's recalcitrance to protect the girl. Jean is no longer a child, and new challenges await her. Fearing temptation for her husband, Mr. Dumusseau's wife accuses Jean of theft, sending her and her mother away. Innocence does not shield one from the evil intentions of another. The succeeding scene shows Jean and her mom hauling themselves through the forest with the weight of their belongings as their future remains uncertain. The two women therefore decide to go to Paris, the capital of all hopes and all dangers. In the following scene, to gain output and live at the minimum of levels, we catch sight of Jean in front of the painters, who passionately trace her beauty. The little girl has grown into a strikingly beautiful young woman. Soon Jean becomes a reader for the widow, Madame de la Garde, who allows her to read extensively, introducing her to literature. Very soon after, Jean matches wits with the cream of nobility. In the following scene, they are all seated at the lunch table when they start to play with words. And when it is Jean's turn, her eloquence strikes the attention of Madame de la Garde's sons, who marvel at her beauty and intelligence. In the evening, Jean finds herself in a moment of gaiety with the two men, earning money for services rendered. However, when caught, Madame de la Garde dismisses her and humiliates her for giving in to desire after everything that she has done for her. Jean embarks on an uncertain road. Through libertinism, however, she learns how to be a woman while still being free. Years go by, and Jean masterfully learns how to lure wealthy lovers, one after another. She becomes an accomplished courtesan. In the ensuing scene, we depict Jean in the midst of the Polish nobility and the lavish parties, seductively dressed to capture the eye of the richest noblemen. We catch sight of her dancing and swinging to the music, when suddenly Monsieur Jean Dubarry joins the scene, and everyone is honored by his arrival. Courtesans jostle to receive him, and upon catching sight of him, Jean approaches him, exuding charm and splendor. Sipping his beverage, Monsieur Dubarry provides her shelter, suggesting that living together is the best choice. After her approval, Jean showers her neck with kisses. Ecstatic at the thought of nailing a rich man who will change her life, Jean is on cloud nine. In the flickering candlelight, we see Jean indulging in noble pleasures, dancing seductively, and fascinating wealthy men. During the celebration, Mr. Richelieu approaches Jean and extends him an offer. The king must meet Jean, as if by chance, believing he has chosen her himself, despite their usual practice of sending women who never capture his attention. Shortly after, Jean inquires after Jean, only to learn that she is helping his son Adolphe with his studies. Jean informs her about the great Marshal de Richelieu's attendance at the ball, alongside courtesans and the wealthy elite. Jean, accusing Jean of pursuing his own desires, retorts that his mistresses contribute nothing to their agreement, advising him to be more discreet. However, Monsieur Dubarry interrupts her, revealing that Mr. Richelieu desires to introduce her to the king. Therefore, Jean offers her the freedom to go. But Jean insists that she will be staying for Adolphe. In an attempt to alter her mind, Jean gently seizes her hand, declaring his love and confessing that, though perhaps not in the way she desires, his feelings are true. Soon afterward, Jean approaches Mr. Richelieu and takes a seat next to him, where she indulges in sweet cakes, but suddenly she finds a gold coin containing the king's portrait, which raises her curiosity about the king's face. The next morning, we see Jean enjoying a bath while reading a book. All of a sudden, Jean storms into the room. Enraged by her ignorance towards the king, he throws her book into the water, holding her head under it, trying to drown her as he hurls insults at her. Soon, he leaves her in tears. In a later conversation with Mr. Richelieu, Jeanne exposes a scar on her face caused by Jean. Richelieu inquires, after having taken stock of her situation, if she desires to change the course of her life. Torn, Jeanne wonders where she will go, and with whom, unable to leave Adolphe behind. Mr. Richelieu suggests introducing her to the king, but Jeanne is not enthusiastic about the idea. When Mr. Richelieu asks about the kind of life she desires, Jeanne, after contemplating deeply, reveals that she is striving for a life of curiosity, one in which she will be able to savor food and drink, write, and read. She thus reflects on her upbringing, a mother who was a cook, with the choice of leading a life of toil or one of nobility, preferring the latter. Soon, the scene shifts to the king's castle. Accompanied by Monsieur du Barry, Jeanne stands in line, awaiting the king's arrival. Each noble is hoping to gain royal favor. The hall falls silent as if the very air is holding its breath when the king makes his entry. Everyone genuflects, their heads bowed down. The king's sharp and observant eyes rest on Jeanne. He is smitten by her beauty. Jeanne smiles warmly in return. As the king rides away, her picture is retained in his mind, a haunting vision of elegance and grace. Later, Jeanne sits intently, instructing young Adolphe, while suddenly, a royal servant, named Laborde, comes in with a note to Mr. du Barry. The king wants to see Jeanne. Jeanne's face lights up with radiance upon hearing the news. As Laborde hands Mr. du Barry a sack of gold coins, he gently asks Jeanne to prepare herself. Before the long glass stands Jeanne. Her image reflects fierce determination. She takes a white flower from a vase and places it delicately in her hair, symbolizing her purity and resolve. Despite Mr. du Barry's concerns, she decides to go immediately. Laborde hands her a black mantle to wrap around her to remain unrecognizable. Jeanne reassures Mr. du Barry that she will return soon, and follows Laborde down the spacious staircase. The carriage heading for Versailles pulses with expectation. As they approach the castle, Jeanne's heart pounds with elation. Inside, Jeanne is ushered into a private room where two doctors examine her well-being, thus pronouncing her fit for the king's bed. Soon, Laborde starts teaching Jeanne the etiquette displayed in Versailles. He is severe yet respectful. She learns the fine points of the courtly, intricate nuances of etiquette to make a proper bow. Laborde advises her to let the king lead, emphasizing that she should never turn her back on him and let her natural charm speak for itself. Jeanne feels a flow of confidence, ready to face whatever might await her in the halls of Versailles. In the dark shimmer of the royal chambers, Laborde ushers Jeanne into the king's apartment. As she comes in, a sudden warm laugh bursts from her lips, which surprises us as much as it does the king. He, curiously, wonders about what amuses her. In a drop of an eye, Jeanne reveals that he reminds her of a 6-franc piece. She kneels before him, expressing her honor. Enchanted, the king invites her for champagne. Once she approaches the table, she discovers the name of the king embossed on the gold cutlery. Questioning her fascination for gold, Jeanne admits her interest. The king turns her attention towards a golden statue behind her. Astonished, Jeanne walks towards it, then suddenly remembers the courtly steps she is supposed to make. She hastily turns back to the king, apologizing. Her spontaneity draws a laugh from him. With the king's permission to move freely, Jeanne approaches the statue with her hands, tracing its outline. She further speculates whether the portrait is of the king as a child, which he confirms. Jeanne draws nearer, sits on his lap, tenderly tracing through his face, and then gently kisses him. Their lips meet again as passionate kisses seal the scene. The following morning, the king retreats to his royal bed. Laborde comes promptly to see Jeanne, asking her to follow him. He takes her through secret passages into a room with a big window overlooking the king's principal hall. Jeanne watches while the king rises, and the royal family and the grand officers are summoned to bear witness. He seems quite annoyed, but the sight somehow thrills Jeanne with delight. The shaver comes in, accompanied by the wig makers, all under her amused eyes. After the end of the show, the royal family leaves for their respective positions, with the women walking backward, which brings laughter to Jeanne's lips, followed by the grand officers and the servants. Later, the king pays Jeanne a visit. He suddenly asks her to close her eyes. Soon, Jeanne opens them to a magnificent necklace made of gold. She opens her eyes wide with disbelief at its elegance. The king expresses his wish for her to stay at Versailles. Elated at this sudden turn of events in her life, Jeanne accepts the offer with a broad smile. She promises to get her dress ready and join the king in a short while. The king exits the room, walking backward, prompting Jeanne to burst into laughter. In the following scene we see Jean, accompanied by Laborde, concealed inside a secret carriage, observing the king from afar. With a spyglass, she questions Laborde about the people surrounding the king. He is flanked by the prime minister, but to Jean, he only exudes malice, for she believes he wishes to put his sister into the king's bed. Her eyes fall upon the Dauphin, caught by the beauty of his demeanor. She inquires about the ladies at court, only to learn that they are the king's daughters, Adelaide, Sophie, Victoire, and Louise. Soon after she inquires about the queen's absence. Laborde informs her that the queen is a discreet lady, but Jean believes it is due to her husband's infidelity. Laborde assures her that the king indeed admires her modesty, meekness, and mildness. As the king is about to ride out on horseback, he catches sight of Jean from afar and smiles at her warmly. Suddenly, one of the king's daughters observes the hidden carriage and approaches it, curiosity piqued. Laborde hastily orders Jean to bow her head. Luckily, the king's daughter does not notice her. Soon enough, the coachman hurries away. In the next scene, we learn that Queen Maria has passed away after an inconspicuous, uneventful 43-year reign. Her passing casts a shadow over the court. It might well be assumed that the way is finally clear for Jean, but the bounds of grief and deceit take her away from the excesses of Versailles and into seclusion in an unassuming little apartment. We find her lying in a bath reading a book, while her mind churns like a turbulent sea with conflicting emotions and unspoken desires. The following scene depicts Laborde leading Jean down the dimly lit corridors to meet the king. While the two are cherishing their stolen moment from everyone's prying eyes, suddenly, the atmosphere changes abruptly with the entrance of Laborde into the room to deliver his somber news. The king's daughter wishes to see him. In a hurry, Jean gathers her belongings, with her heart pounding, and slips through a discreet door, leaving the warmth of their private sanctuary. The king sits in his fullest chamber as his daughters come in, red-faced and hot. They accuse him of the scandalous rumor going around Versailles that he spends every night in the company of women. The king cuts in with an irritated and tired face and affirms that there is nothing unusual about visiting a friend, thereby ending the denial of his encounters with Jean. But he soon reveals that she is married and has a son. Adelaide, outraged, insists that Jean isn't really married and that the son is not hers. She believes Jean to be foolish, but the king keeps defending her. His daughters confess that they are being ridiculed throughout Versailles as a result of his debauchery, their voices rising in exasperation. The shining-eyed, tear-unshed Louise reminds him that their mother has just passed away, begging for a little respect in their bereavement. The king rises to his full height, declaring the questioning over, yet his daughters persist, stating that they cannot tolerate making his mistress his favorite while they are still grieving. They soon exit the chamber, disappointment etched on their faces. In the ensuing scene, we see the king walking through the opulent corridors of the castle, accompanied by his faithful assistant. In a serious tone, Laborde reports to the king that the prime minister has discovered Jean's lineage and will not tolerate any one of her ilk in his retinue. But the king, unmoved and adamant, confesses in a sincere voice that he wishes to be by her side at both sunrise and sunset, the weight of his feelings evident in his gaze. Before his departure, the king instructs Laborde to set the wheels in motion, arrange all the necessary measures for the official recognition of Jean in court. She needs a husband and a noble title to make her position secure. Luckily, Jean du Barry agrees to marry her for a handsome sum of money. The scene cuts to the door of a quaint church, as the couple stands in front of the priest to make their marriage vows. Though still in a dilemma, Jean's heart soars as the priest declares them husband and wife. Not long after Jean returns to Versailles, we find her together with Laborde, who is teaching her about the castle's norms. He questions her about the people living at the court, the king's daily pursuits, and the secrets of Versailles. She fascinates him with every answer, sharp-witted and sharp-brained. Going the extra mile, Laborde teaches her the 3 bows of farewell, proving to be a very great mentor. He instructs her to avert her eyes from the king, to avoid misunderstanding. It could be perceived as haughtiness, or an invitation to flirtation. Excitement runs in her veins as she imagines herself in front of the court. The moment finally arrives. The audience awaits her entrance with bated breath. Upon the heralding of her arrival, Jean enters majestically, adorned in a gown that radiates purity, captivating the audience with her charm. Fully confident, she strides up to the king, who is completely overwhelmed by her beauty. She disregards Laborde's caution and falls at the king's feet, only to lock eyes with the king, a move that exposes her to the ire of the royal family. Whispers regarding her disrespect splashes through the audience as the king receives her with warm smiles, undeterred by the commotion. Outraged at Jean's audacity, he prompts his daughters to storm out of the celebration. Later in the evening, festivity ensues with the esteemed guests. The atmosphere changes when Laborde interrupts, inviting everyone to take their seats for the king's special gift to the Countess du Barry. On their side, the king's daughters feel their blood running in fury at Jean's presence and the special attention their father is giving her, while their hearts of Jean race in anticipation. Soon enough, Laborde arrives with a huge box, and sparks of excitement illuminate Jean's eyes. A small black boy pops out of the box, startling the assembly. The little boy recites one of Jean's cherished poems. Jean, deeply stirred, passionately plants a kiss on the king's cheek before she rushes over to the little boy. Adolphe's jealousy is kept merely at bay. He is afraid of losing his special place in Jean's heart. Jean gently questions the boy about his name, Zamor. She warmly receives him among them with a soft kiss on his tiny hand, a shining woman of great kindness. They spend joyful moments together, running along castle corridors with the sound of laughter bouncing at their heels. Laborde leads them to the richly ornamented quarters of the Countess, where she stands in awe of the exquisite decoration and the grandness of her new suite. Laborde ushers her into the company of ladies-in-waiting, dressers, and maids of honor, who stand at her disposal. In this enchanting realm, Jean finally lives her dream. In the following sequence, we observe Jean and Zamor frolicking in the enormous glistening lake of Versailles. The water scintillates with the golden sunbeams as the two play around, splashing with water and shattering into bursts of laughter. Then they lay on the green grass, indulging in the simple pleasures of life. With the king's love as her shield, Jean infuses the Palace of Versailles with her passion for simplicity and art. The grand halls of Versailles resound with the creative potential of artists and poets who have been encouraged by her example. She is acutely aware that the Dauphin is destined to marry an 11-year-old Austrian noble girl named Marie Antoinette, who will be introduced to him once she comes of age. For the time being, Jean stands as the first lady of the court, but she acknowledges that her position is insecure. The king could easily replace her at the slightest misstep with another from the Parc aux Cerfs. In the next scene, the king is engrossed in observing the moon through his telescope, marveling at its divine beauty. Jean sits beside him, her face a picture of concern and great thought. Sensing her unease, the king inquires if something is amiss. Jean confesses that only the stars matter to him, prompting a laugh from the king, who confesses his love to her. Giggling and muttering together, they are observed by Laborde, who smiles at the sight of their harmony. In the following scene, the king and Jean pass through the court, turning everybody's heads at the remarkable sight of Jean walking arm in arm with the king. This is Jean's first public exposure. For the first time in the French court, a woman breaks tradition by adopting masculine attire instead of wearing headpieces or wigs. Every face is agape in the court as they look upon her audacity. Soon they ride their horses and depart, with Jean holding Adolphe's hand, whom she has always loved. Later, we see Jean with Monsieur du Barry, his wife, and Adolphe gathered. She voices her concerns, warning Jean that her newfound rank could be fleeting. Jean, confident, dismisses the notion, but Madame du Barry cautions her against arrogance, reminding her that the king's affections could wane. Monsieur du Barry interrupts, questioning why the king hasn't married her if he cannot resist her. Jean explains that for such a marriage to occur, her current marriage to Monsieur du Barry would need to be annulled, which the clergy would never permit. In the ensuing scene, the king presents Jean with a key to a magnificent castle by the lake. Jean jumps into his arms, overwhelmed with the surprise. She finally finds peace in her own haven, where she can retreat with her beloved king, free from others' watchful eyes, charting her path. And as the fire crackles with a soft glow, laughter dances between them like a treasured melody. In the following morning, Jean and Zamor visit the king's daughters, a reunion tensely awaited. At their entrance, mocking laughter pierces the calm of the morning, and cruel words are flung at Zamor, whose rich skin tone becomes the target of their derision. In this whirlwind of contempt, however, Louise, their younger sister, breaks with wisdom and says that though he is of another race, he is still a brother in Christ. She offers Zamor a piece of cake gently, a tiny gesture that cuts through all cruelty. After their departure, Jean takes Zamor in her arms and tries to soften his pain. On that fateful night, we depict Louise kneeling in prayer, tears glistening on her cheeks, bound to a decision weighing heavy on her heart. Humbled by the sarcasm of her sisters, she renounces the title and privileges and decides to pursue the path of the monastic order. Sadly, she leaves Versailles. Her departure turns the king into despair. He retires from the world, refusing to eat and wrestling with the sorrow of loss. In the midst of all this tumult, a mistress sits next to him when the door bursts open, revealing Laborde, who announces the arrival of the Countess du Barry. The mistress disappears behind a secret door. Jean's eyes rested on the table set with lavish food, which was a shocking realization that he had sought comfort with someone else. The king gestures for her to leave, a surprising turn from his once warm attitude. Grief grips Jean as she steps away. She soon learns that it is Madame de Briche who lingers at the king's side. Doubt gnaws at her mind as she wonders if she is waning in the king's affections, but Laborde warns her to hold her ground. His words ring in her ears. Thus, Jean remains in the king's favor. 4 happy years slide by with the king, who slowly regains his zest. Zamor grows into an elegant gentleman, cultured and suave, under the tender tutelage of Jean's maternal spirit. On the other hand, Jean warmly receives Adolphe at court. Anxiously considering his future, she arranges for him to be married to a young lady from the bourgeois class, the woman with whom he has fallen in love. Adolphe and Zamor stand as witnesses to the ties that bind love and resilience. Through such companionship, the king's love for Jean shines brightly as a beacon. He presents her with a gold ring, a symbol of his love. Jean receives it with a grateful heart, sealing the scene with a scorching kiss like the sun. With the approaching arrival of Marie Antoinette, the court is stirred in anticipation of her wedding to the Dauphin, a pageant expertly choreographed by the Prime Minister. Jean observes the drama unfolding before her with a spyglass, weighted heavy with the feeling of doom. In the evening festivities, Jean makes her entrance. Attired in white, she attracts whispers for her boldness. What irks the court in its entirety, however, is her public display of affection towards the king, the kiss through the veil. The Prime Minister begins to whisper shame, believing Jean to be unfit for a Christian king. As Jean shares tender giggles with the king, the Dauphin watches them happily as tension builds around them. As Adelaide continues to goad Marie Antoinette into using her power against Jean, the soon-to-be queen decides to announce herself as Jean's rival. In the ensuing scene, as the court gathers to pray in the church, Jean vainly seeks a place to sit. She is pushed aside by Adelaide and her sisters, by the future queen, and by her attendants. Just as all hope seems lost, the kind Dauphin saves the day by yielding a place for Jean to sit beside him, an inconspicuous act of graciousness in a world devoured by envy and ambition. It is within these halls of Versailles that Jean's world falls apart. Scarcely have the prayers begun when Laborde hastens to Jean, carrying reprehensible news of Adolphe's defeat in a duel, leaving him mortally wounded. Immediately, Jean rushes to his side, dread filling her heart. There, on the blood-stained bedsheets, are Monsieur du Barry's silent, falling tears. Jean's cries pierce the stillness. Her soul shatters as her sweet boy is lost forever. All the opulence of Versailles fades to naught, for no comfort will mend the chasm left by Adolphe's passing. Only the king's love comforts her, a thin thread for her to cling to against the tapestry of her loss. The court gathers to watch a performance by a magician, and the future queen and the king's daughters are in their playful elements, provocative in their scorn. Jean, pale and distant, is propped on the shoulder of the king. Her mind is a labyrinth of sorrow. Marie Antoinette's scornful gaze rips apart the air, and then the silent command of the king brings a transitory reprieve. He gestures towards Marie Antoinette's servant, warning mercy about her behavior towards Jean. However, the court's cruelty does not subside, nor does the weight in Jean's heart. For days to come, no solace is found within the queen's speech but an increasing loathing. The king's anger flares, a silent storm shaking the foundation of the court. Mercy's words of caution do not find a place in the future queen's ears, and with such behavior, she endangers the very fragile alliance between France and Austria. In this maelstrom, Jean finds a sliver of hope. While she wanders around Versailles with Zamor and her servant, she encounters the future queen. She kneels before her and is finally recognized. Marie Antoinette addresses her. Excited by the tidings, she rushes to the king, embracing him tightly. 9 words from Marie Antoinette's beautiful mouth spare Jean from disgrace, finally earning the royal family's acknowledgement. We depict her happy days with the king. Their last moment of delight is seen by the lake, where the king draws her passionately as she lies reading a book. The stars, which once predicted the great love of the two, now tell a different fortune. Emaciated, the king is soon transported from Jean's castle to Versailles, where he receives proper medical attention. After the doctor's examination, they confirm their worst fear: smallpox, much to Jean's despair. Indeed, his immune system isn't strong enough to fight off the viruses. However, Jean and Laborde decide not to inform the king out of fear that it might be his last blow of spirit. Laborde warns Jean that after the king's passing, the royal family will expel her and advises her to get ready to leave. But Jean refuses and chooses to stay with her beloved Louis. Jean, by the side of the king, soothes his pain and comforts him. On his request for a mirror, Laborde reluctantly brings him one, exposing the horrific image of the king. The king, in his quest for repentance, confesses his fears to Jean, prompting her tearful departure after kissing his hand affectionately. As the king grows feeble, Jean readies to leave the castle. We depict her gathering her belongings with Zamor and her maids. On her way out, Jean rushes back to the castle, seeking a final encounter with the king. Her admittance is refused by the king's daughters and the ministers at the outset, but the Dauphin intercedes on her behalf. The affectionate moments that the king and Jean share, short-lived, full of pathos, are immortal. Jean walks into the somber room, where grief and sorrow settle in. With every step she feels the weight of a life once shared, full of joy, turned into a nightmare. Her face is streaming with tears as she comes closer to the king. His frail hand grips her face, sensing her presence and touching her for the last time. "I love you" escapes her lips, her voice trembling with raw emotion. The king confesses his deep affection for her, his heart heavy with the inevitability of their parting. Soon, Jean exits the room. Outside, she thanks the Dauphin for his gentility and warmth. In the next scene, Jean bids her beloved Zamor farewell. His stalwart eyes are full of concern as she reassures him they will meet again. Before riding the carriage, she envelops Laborde tightly, tears streaming down their faces. She expresses her deep gratitude to him for his constant support and departs, though neither of them knows that this is their last goodbye. Heavily hearted, Jean leaves behind those dear to her within the gilded halls of Versailles, the memories of laughter and love echoing through her mind as she goes to her uncertain future. In the subsequent sequence, we depict Laborde by the king's side. The half-broken but determined voice of the king asks him to look after Jean. The king utters 3 painful words to bid Laborde farewell. "You are my friend," leaving the latter weeping. When the king takes his last breath, his passing is announced to the court, which casts an air of despair upon the assembled nobility. Meanwhile, Jean arrives at her final destination, greeted by the somber nuns in their crisp black habits. After a life of great luxury, Jean finds herself in a small dark room, bemoaning her fate. Thus stands condemned Jean before the church's scorn and the monarchy's disdain, forever branded as sinful. Confined for a year within the cold, smothering confines of the convent, her spirit slowly being stifled under isolation until Louis XVI finally brings her a frail reprieve, though with the weighty stipulation that she was not to set foot again on the grounds of Versailles. She retires to Louveciennes and lives there for 15 peaceful years. But when the revolution broke out, it tore apart the privileges of the ancient regime as it unraveled the fabric of society. The nobles buried their quarrels. Even Marie Antoinette extended her hand to Jean in friendship, a fragile bond amidst the chaos. Yet the storm bodes decisions, and Zamor, rocked between despair and bitterness, sides with the Republicans and turns his back on his former mistress. The murmurs of the common people reverberate with judgment against Jean, as one who has forsaken her origins. The shadow of the guillotine stalks them down. Louis XVI on January 21, 1793, Marie Antoinette on October 16, and finally, Jean on December 8. As she mounts the scaffold, her heart heavy with the sense of betrayal, she delivers a touching goodbye, begging the executioner for one more minute. She looks upwards at the sky in a last appeal to the universe, which once gently sheltered her illusions, finding comfort in the stars, those witnesses to her brief passage.